Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 19th February 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, but deep behind the technical desk, is Mike Robinson, and we're going to be joined by live video Skype link by David Scott from Northern Exposure. Now, David's already told me that the weather in the Perth area is grey and dry, so that's quite good. It's raining in London, and it is certainly raining here in Plymouth. It's also a bit on the chilly side, hence the sweater. In fact, our new studio is so big, we get clouds forming just under the ceiling. But the prize goes to Hampshire, where apparently we've got blue sky. Well, there we are, mixed bag in the weather area. The news today, well, we've got a lot of very interesting points, and we're going to kick off with economics. So I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Or hand over to David, rather. Sorry about that. So, David, 4 years of producer price deflation in China. What was your point here?
Well, it's 4 years is the last year. If you see the dip that the producer prices are taking there in China, there are many reasons for producer prices to go down. It could reflect increased efficiency in the production of goods, but it equally could signify, as RBS is suggesting here, an oversupply of production goods. As you go into a recession, the higher order goods, the producer goods, are affected disproportionately, affected far more severely, and affected first. So what you're seeing there is an early sign of the world slipping into recession, and the Chinese producer goods not responding, and as a result, seeing a drop in price.
Indeed, but it's in parallel with that, we've got huge amounts of loans being created.
Yes, vast amounts of debt is being created all over the world. Everyone's doing debt. I mean, as you know, Japan lives on debt. We have no small amount in this country, but China is having accelerating levels of debt as well. You're seeing some astronomically large figures coming forward just now, and you have to remember what that is actually doing. It's moving future production and bringing it into the present. It's a change, an intertemporal change. Now, if that represents something real, where people are saving more and they want to spend less now and have more in the future, then that's fine. If it's funny money printing, and I suspect it is, then that's not fine. That causes the booms and the busts.
And Zero Hedge here reporting that 520 billion in 1 month.
In a month, yes, 500 billion in a month. I thought that was an astronomical figure. I mean, we're talking about an economy roughly the size of America's now in total output terms. And yes, you did actually have Ben Bernanke doubling the base money supply and having that sort of level of increase in debt or in money supply back in 2008, when panic was in the air, and do something now, the entire ship is going down, was basically the cry. Do anything, no matter how extreme. So we're seeing similar figures, similar orders now coming out of China. That suggests to me that more extreme measures are now being taken.
This one, the government money and bureaucratic control, you're suggesting that China has a problem still with its centralized control?
Well, yes. I mean, we all have a problem with centralized control. We're not immune to it here. In fact, in some ways, China's become more free than many parts of the States. If you look at the bureaucratic control on, say, the use of farmland, the use of rainwater, the gathering of rainwater, in America, there's enormous bureaucratic control. But China certainly has that, and it's a huge break and a huge drag on the economy. And it makes it less responsive, it makes it far more expensive, and it's not a system that innovates, and not a system that produces a great deal of plenty. It simply lives off of other parts of the economy.
Well, there's not much to be said about this one, is there?
Well, I liked it because this is the false choice. I mean, we're in Scotland. We're going to have another election soon, and we're going to have to make some choices. Now, I think in Scotland, actually, there might be some choices in some areas, Name Person, for example. But here you see a comment on the ongoing soap opera that is the American presidential election. And you have a choice between tax and spend and borrow and spend. And I think that's really very good. You have, in fact, obviously, actually, both parties do both. The spending is the life of the state. They need that in order to maintain their power, in order to maintain their support, and the money cannot be gained by legitimate means. It's gained through various forms of theft, tax being a fairly obvious one, but borrowing against children's tax is a far more stealthy form of theft, and then simply printing money, increasing the money supply and devaluing the currency is the other favourite stealthy form of thievery.
Okay, and you're suggesting that China's up to a bit of borrowing and spending at the moment?
Oh yes, it certainly is. I mean, half a billion dollars in 1 month.
Half
Yes,
a trillion?
I think we're doing some half a trillion. Yes, sorry, beg your pardon. Half a trillion in a month. Yes, we're doing some borrowing and spending there.
Right, well, look, I just wanted to put a little bit of additional perspective on this because, of course, that $500 billion, which we can see on the left, perhaps we can see that in the context of something here, which is the foreign exchange reserves that China has still $3.65 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. Now, of course, when you put China's total debt beside that, it doesn't look quite so impressive. But China's total debt at the moment is in the region of $28 trillion, even despite that $500 billion that they've just added to it. And one of the points that I think we need to keep in mind is that, of course, when Chinese debt is discussed, it's China's total debt. That includes government debt, but it's all debt, all bank-rated debt, and so on. But when we're talking about national debt in the West here, it's usually referring to government debt, so that we have to compare apples with apples. So let's do that, because here's the US total debt approaching $60 trillion, and their foreign exchange reserves, well, oh dear, they're something in the region of 117 billion. So in other words, nothing. So they have nothing in their back pocket for a rainy day, as it were. So we'll go on. China's debt has grown. There's no question of that. As a percentage of GDP, it was just over 150% of GDP in 2007. It's around 240% of GDP in 2015. It's probably gone up just a little bit in the last couple of months. But oh dear, if we actually compare apples with apples again, and we look at UK outstanding debt, we find that we're in the situation of being 756% of GDP in debt. Now, a large chunk of that, I acknowledge, isn't debt in the traditional sense, in the sense that it wasn't borrowed money, because $5 trillion of that is state pensions, the black hole there. But that's included because it's still an obligation which has to be met somehow. So China...
Unfunded liabilities here and in the States are enormous and actually dwarf the official government debt, particularly in the case of the United States, where you're looking at 17 million official government debt, 17
trillion.
17 trillion official government debt, and estimates of the unfunded liabilities go up to 200 trillion.
So, and if we look at the global picture, this is a year out of date now, and I haven't updated it, but nonetheless, it gives a good impression of what has happened with debt globally. Never mind China, over the last 15 years or so. Not a great situation. And to
that you have to compare what has happened to the world economy, because if that debt was going to increase efficiency, increase manufacturing, because people were actually saving and wanted more production in the future, you would have growth in the world economy. And over that period, the world economy has been pretty well flat. There's not been growth. There's not been growth that balances or in any way counterbalances the debt.
Right. The other point that I wanted to make here was what China's doing with the money that they have. They're building infrastructure everywhere. Now, well, we can have a conversation about that in a second, David. But if we compare what China's doing with their money with what we're doing with ours, and the picture, again, is not great. $1.2 quadrillion in derivatives debt outstanding. How many zeros is that? Let's just look at it. The point here is China is under attack at the moment. David's George Soros fully deployed to destroy the Chinese currency and stock market if he can. China's monetary decisions, I think, have to be seen in that context as well. So the question is China building a massive debt bubble as a matter of policy? The Federal Reserve Bank has been building a massive debt bubble, as is the Bank of England, as a matter of policy. Do you think that is the situation in China, or is it that China's policy is to use money to invest in productive industry, and when the funny money melts into thin air where it came from, then perhaps they're going to be left holding something physical at the end?
Well, I mean, I would rather have a building than a derivatives contract when the bubble goes up. That's certainly the case. But I think that what China has been doing is mixing central control and central planning with Keynesian economics, and that's a toxic brew, and it will take them down, and it will lead to serious problems in the future. And when you have those serious problems in a country like China, you will have huge social unrest and social instability, and you have to be very careful, because the normal response to that is, let's get an external enemy to concentrate on and keep all of the people in line because there's war. So that's the danger we run. You're quite right to compare the situation to the West, because the indebted levels in the West, Japan is the worst, but it's not good in Britain, it's not good in America. The debt that we've incurred will never be repaid. It can only be defaulted on by one means or another. Either we default honestly, or we inflate it away in funny money printing. It can never be repaid. It will never be repaid. One of the difficulties that China has, they hold all this foreign reserve. How much is that really going to be worth? If they actually try to spend that, what could you actually buy with it?
I think that's a fairly good point, because most of it, of course, is held in US government bonds.
Yes. So if they stop, and if they decide to stop buying US government bonds, as they've been cutting back hugely on buying government bonds, if the Fed doesn't buy them, they take these bonds to the market and say, we want to change these bonds into something more fungible, something that we can actually take and build a power station with. Who's going to be the buyer? You need a buyer as well as a seller. So they will have exported all these real goods to the United States. In response, for all this hard work, labor, real resources, they have got some paper. What's that paper going to be worth? I'm not so sure that that's going to be worth very much.
Okay, well, David and Mike, thank you very much for that excellent analysis. In the chat room, one of the comments is that the BBC is apparently reporting that HSBC Bank will be introducing biometrics in order to get your money. And perhaps we also ought to acknowledge the fact that overwhelmingly the money is electronic money created out of thin air. So I'm sure that if Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group is watching us today, he will be thinking, well, what we need to do in the UK at least is to reintroduce the Bradbury pound, money issued as credit on the overall value of the nation. But I'll just pick up, David, you mentioned policy several times there. Perhaps that was Mike, but you were saying, well, there's a policy behind this. I'd like to come in at a different angle and say, isn't it remarkable that wherever we go, we see the common purpose policy at work? And you've focused on China, so let's have a look at what common purpose is up to at the moment. Well, this remarkable political charity is embedding itself in China now, working with the All China Youth Federation and one of the Chinese newspapers. And we have this lady, Julia Middleton, the chief executive, who is now working in China in order to give the Chinese cultural intelligence. This is remarkable, isn't it, that we've got a nation that's existed for thousands of years and could reasonably be called one of the most intelligent nations that we've got on the planet. But no, they need Julia Middleton, who is getting in there to help young Chinese understand what they need to do to become one of her global leaders. And the reason we picked up on this particular topic is not actually from the Chinese angle. It's thanks to one of our viewers who pointed out this video clip of Jeb Bush at the presidential primary debate in South Carolina on Saturday, the 13th of February. And he picked up that at about 1 minute 14 in this video clip, Jeb Bush states, "I believe I will have a steady hand as Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States. I will unite this country around common purposes." Now, this seemed to be an uncanny similarity with this phrase that we've heard before, and I thought it would be good to jump back to 2008, and here is the Sunday Telegraph on the 2nd of March, pointing out another amazing coincidence, which is that both Barack Obama and Gordon Brown were using the phrase common purpose, a politics of common purpose. Just a coincidence, we were led to believe. So Barack Obama coming out with that in Iowa, December 2007, and Gordon Brown using the common purpose expression in Birmingham, March 2008. And if we jump into the common purpose bed, we're going to encounter Julia Middleton. We've labelled that lovely photograph, "Trust me with the minds of your children and young people." Remember that it's not just British children. Common Purpose is now openly boasting that it's working worldwide in order to train children to become future leaders. And they are going to have to use global cultural intelligence in their global leadership function. Well, what sort of leadership does this lady believe in? These are some of the phrases that she recommends in her book, Beyond Authority. She's very big on building coalitions and conspiring. She thinks that people should and can be used as useful idiots. If you're intelligent, if you're a doctor, or you're in the intelligentsia, then you can become one of her expert idiots. But definitely she's working with a fifth column, which she believes on the inside can change any agenda. And if you stand up against this pernicious political charity, then according to Julia Middleton's book, you can be run over, undermined, or discredited. So China is not alone in receiving the attention of this remarkable political charity, because apparently Ms. Middleton's also been heavily at work in Australia and Singapore, also taking her version of cultural intelligence into those areas. And we'll just remind people of the sorts of phrases that she really believes in. And during her trip around Australia and Singapore, she's been to the Times Higher Education World Academic Summit. So here's the quasi-British political agenda coming in through Common Purpose. But she's also boasting, of course, that she's been talking to the UN Development Programme, British Petroleum, and the hydrocarbon giant Worley Parsons. So we've said there, who is this woman and what's her real agenda? But really she says it to introduce a complete world change in the way people think and behave. And of course, you're only going to have a position if you've been selected as a future leader. David, I'll just give you a right of reply there or comment. I've got a couple more bits to add to this. It's astonishing what this charity is up to.
It is, and of course, the former head of the Scottish Civil Service and the man who introduced the new Scottish model of government, Sir John Elvidge, who is Common Purpose, was one of the initial spearhead into China and particularly Hong Kong in his particular case, to take the Common Purpose message to the Far East.
Right. Well, let's add this bit to it. Let's bring in this man, Jeff Mulgan. We've mentioned him many times before. From a Marxist background to Common Purpose, then working as a chief advisor to Gordon Brown, on reframing the British public. We can only give you a glimpse at him in today's news, but if you Google and do your homework, particularly look at Nesta and the Young Foundation and the Cabinet Office's behavioural change unit, you will see the power of this man. Great friend of Julia Middleton, of course. And this is what he's been up to. So he's working on city collaborative partnerships. He's been interested in what tools can help big cities and big city administrations to think. That's very interesting. Remember Mike Robinson's comments on the rise of the city-states that we're seeing. And here he is in this particular paper talking about collective intelligence. And he thinks that he needs to look at the components of intelligence to help cities perform better. This is very murky stuff, David. We're seeing raw behavioural psychology injected into young people and the mechanics of a democracy. Surely this is undermining anything that could be remotely called democratic.
Yes, because democratic, as the word used to be understood, required adherence to the rule of law, and it required individualism. It required people to have their views and express them in public in a free and open manner. This groupthink is something else. It's interesting that it's always predicated on failure. You know, how do we make city governments and councils think? Well, that's an admission that the standard of decision making has been thoughtless, has been not intelligent. The tendency is to point to failure in the workings of the state and say, see how stupid and dumb and slow and unhelpful and how many unforeseen negative consequences we've created. We need to do something. Okay. And that means, and then you get this new agenda rolled out as the something that must be done. And the something that must be done always seems to be using words like collective and collaborative. And what the something must be done is everybody has to start thinking as a hive, as the Borg cube ship.
Yep.
And that's the way it always seems to play out. It always seems to end up with less individual liberty, more state control, more people watching, and this is somehow meant to solve the problems of state control. I don't think so.
I think it's going to bring in more state control, and a very vicious state control of a type and depth that we've never seen before. Just add to a bit, and then we'll get back to your subjects north of the border. But I just wanted to show people this one again, a Telegraph article where it was talking about the German defence minister, the lovely Ursula von der Leyen. And she'd been complaining that there weren't enough women generals in the German army. And part of the statement she made was this: we've got many young women doctors, but at the top of the army there are no women. And then she says, I think men are not per se more brutal, radical and warlike than women. That was of interest, but it's the bit at the bottom. Military service no longer depends on physical strength, but also on mental health, technical skills and leadership. Now, mental health there will probably have moved past other people, but we picked up on it because here's mental health, and this is a paper from October 1940 in which the psychiatrist Colonel J.R. Rees was expounding that psychiatrists, principally his ilk, needed to get amongst society to make us mentally healthy. He said they should infiltrate the social and professional organisations. They should educate all ages within schools and universities. And he said that they should unleash a long-term plan of propaganda to install mental hygiene. The paper's real. You can read this for yourself. Here's part of the text where they also say, don't let us mention mental hygiene. We can write in safely in terms of mental health and common sense, but let's not tell the ignorant, unwashed masses that really we are going to control their minds under the title of mental hygiene. And you'll notice that his paper was not entitled mental hygiene, it was mental health. Well, that brings us nicely onto the NHS, and of course it's almost exclusively the UK column that's warned of the damage to the NHS, since Common Purpose has been very deep inside the training. And that leads me to this, a petition which we are supporting. Why are we supporting this petition? Because it is right, but also this is a way of bringing into the public arena the fact that the Liverpool Care Pathway is using forced starvation and dehydration as a way of killing off patients who are not cost effective. Not only elderly patients, patients with learning difficulties, children, anybody now who the NHS can't afford to treat is to be simply removed, and we know that's being done through the Liverpool Care Pathway. So I would like to ask for your support in highlighting this particular petition. The address is on the bottom of your screen there. It's not just a case of a petition for the government. This is the start of getting this horrific subject into the public domain. Well, we will come back to David Scott. And David, you're going to take us into the arena of rents. Are we going to be able to afford any form of dwelling in the future?
Well, don't worry, the Green Party will save you. The Green Party, Scotland and England, the two different parties, are campaigning hard for rent control. Now, rent control is the single most effective way of destroying a city. It's more effective than carpet bombing, but it's just less spectacular because it brings in a whole series of perverse incentives and ultimately means that things like maintenance can't be afforded, the housing stock deteriorates, there are shortages, there is rationing by assorted means, be it official or unofficial, and it promotes toxic relationships between landlords and tenants. So rent control is where they want. It's economically illiterate, as most of the things from the Green Party are, and they're pushing quite hard and seem to be making some headway in convincing my fellow countrymen that this is a good idea, when quite clearly it is not. They will see more than 53% of Scots want a rent control system. In fact, the person who introduced rent control into Glasgow, Mary Barber, is lauded, and there's lecture theatres named after her, and there's statues of her because she introduced rent control. And they don't tie up, the people who applaud this move, which was made during the First World War, don't tie up the link between that and the fact that a generation later we had to knock most of Glasgow down. My recollection of Glasgow as a small boy was a sea of rubble. And the reason that happened was lack of maintenance of the buildings, decade after decade. And why did that happen? Because there was rent control and the landlords simply could not afford to maintain the buildings. So we had a Glasgow of slums. So we had a beautiful Victorian city built in about 30 years flat. All the tenements went up when Glasgow boomed in the Victorian period. We managed to afford that in the private sector. But once we had rent control, we couldn't even afford to maintain those buildings. And they all got knocked down and mostly replaced with hideous city-scarring modernist blocks, which have subsequently had to be knocked down in their turn.
David, you've got generation rent here, 9 million private renters, and I'll quickly bring this one up as well. This is Mises Institute, Unintended Consequences of Rent Control.
Yes, I would recommend anyone to go and have a look at this article. The Mises Institute talk very well about the unintended consequences. They go into how people who became landlords, they maybe actually inherited a building, and they found themselves, they became slumlords because the rent control was such that someone of very modest means inherited an apartment block. All they had was a huge liability, and they couldn't actually maintain the block on the rents that were coming in. So essentially inheriting a large building made them bankrupt. It's a very, very perverse system. And you also have an encouragement for things like bigotry and prejudice, because there's such a shortage of homes to live in that landlords have to distribute the available space on some basis. If it's not done through through a price, through a fair market rent. It'll be done by some other means.
Right.
The generation rent issue is why it's so difficult and so expensive to buy a house in Britain, and that's one we don't have time to go into in detail today, but I would simply point out that worldwide, the most significant correlation between house prices and another factor is in fact planning controls.
Right. Now, you've mentioned Mary Barber before. We'll just bring her up on screen. Campaign to create a lasting memorial.
Yes, she's extremely popular. People think she's a wonderful woman and did wonderful work to prevent the evil landlords responding to market forces and charging a fair market rent. And this was during the First World War, when, of course, Glasgow was booming as part of the munitions industry, as a major centre of the munitions industry, as we fought the First World War. So it was an extremely abnormal time. Lots of workers came into Glasgow. And what you would normally get is available space would be distributed by price, would be rationed essentially by price. She avoided that, but what happens if you have two people looking for the one space? If you put in rent control, that doesn't actually create any more buildings, and it doesn't allow the market to clear. It doesn't allow incentives to be created to create more housing. So it skews the market, and it prevents development. And I say in the long term, in her role in Glasgow, she did far more harm to Glasgow than the Luftwaffe ever did.
Well, that's a phrase that we've heard here in Plymouth of Plymouth City Council, that they did more damage than the Luftwaffe. We could have an interesting discussion on that. I'll just add that one of the things that we've been alerted to is that local housing associations in Plymouth are now moving in amongst more traditional housing areas. So you'll think you're in an area of privately owned housing, but actually in a street, 3 or 4 or 5 of the houses have slowly been bought up with the local housing associations. And of course, people renting through those housing associations are now controlled in what they can do, and in some parts of the country, what they can say. Well, negative interest rates was another topic you would like to cover. I'll just say that we've obviously covered quite a lot of financial stuff, so I'm keen to move on to what you've got to report on Sheikh Ubay and Sir Stephen House. But what's happening in the negative interest rate scene?
Well, let us just flag up very briefly that negative interest rates are coming. They're coming worldwide. We thought that zero interest rate policy was mad enough for any lifetime to experience, but no, negative interest rates are on the way. It is a loopy scheme, which is to try and force people to spend now, because you'll borrow now, borrow £100 now, you only have to pay back £97, go out and spend that £100, and hey, you're ahead. In a world of peak debt, it makes no sense. In a world where you actually have to have somebody lending the money, there has to be an incentive to lend, it makes no sense. And in a world where you need capital accumulation in order to have capitalism, in order to have growth, in order to have improvements in productivity, having negative interest rates simply destroys capital. It destroys saving. There is no incentive to save in a negative interest rate world. So it's profoundly crazy as a system, and it will have enormous harmful consequences. So we should watch that as it develops.
Okay, well, seems crazy to me. Named person scheme has obviously been a very important one for you. What is the latest on named persons north of the border?
Yes, here we have a report that Aberdeen Council are finding it increasingly difficult, as are many other councils in Scotland, to recruit teachers. There's a big teacher shortage. The number of teachers is centrally planned. It's not going well. And there are huge numbers of unfilled posts. There are vast amounts of money being spent on supply teachers to paper over the cracks and have someone in the classrooms. And Aberdeen Council and others are unable to recruit. And one of the reasons that they are citing as to the difficulty of recruiting teachers is the named person scheme puts requirements on teachers, particularly head teachers, which are so onerous, to be this state guardian for hundreds of children, that people are looking at this and quite sensibly concluding, I don't want that job, no thank you. So we have a problem, and it's the cracks are showing.
I wonder whether the solution will be to bring in teachers from overseas. Well, if we're talking children, we're going to also be talking maternity matters here. What's core
The solution,
component?
just actually while you're on that subject, the solution, and I'm not making this up, the solution is to go back to teachers who applied to become teachers and were rejected as not of the required caliber, and say to them, please apply again. That's what's currently happening.
Right. Okay, so core component, what's this one?
Right. Now, this is a detailed description of how maternity is assessed. Right. So when you go to the first booking in clinic as a pregnant woman in Scotland, you are assessed as to your ability to raise your unborn child. And we now have more detail on this, and the detail is quite interesting. What we've got in this little document is a whole series of requirements to apply the Shinari indicators, safe, healthy, etc., to the unborn child. So let me just read out one or two quick excerpts for you. The midwife is going to have to assess whether or not the unborn child is safe. The comment here is, hang on, long documents, here we go. The comment here is understanding and acknowledgement of the unborn baby's right to be protected from harm. Did you catch that? Right? Because that's been an argument for many a long year in this country and across the West as to whether the unborn baby has such a right. And we've been assured by our wise overlords that it doesn't, and it's not really a person. But no, now in Scotland we have understanding and acknowledgement of the unborn baby's right to be protected from harm.
Right.
And then it goes on to living conditions and parental capacity. Parental capacity, skills, abilities and experience. So there will be an assessment of your parenting ability. How that's done, I don't know. But
What I was going to say, well, the other thing is most of us never get any training to become that parent. You become it's on-the-job training, I think it's called.
It's on-the-job training. Everybody does it differently. There is no right way and no wrong way. And if you have more than one child, you probably do it differently with each child because, hey, they're individuals. And this is now going to be assessed by the state. But the key point here that was of interest is the safe and healthy. It also goes on healthy, understanding and acknowledgement of the unborn baby's right to positive health. Now, this is happening from 10 weeks in Scotland. 10 weeks from conception, this process starts. And simultaneously, the state is killing babies who are 10 weeks from conception. So on the one hand, they're saying the baby has a right to be safe. And on the other hand, they're saying we have the right to kill it. It seems to be surprisingly incoherent. A more extreme version of what age is a child. You know, under the named person scheme, a child is up to 18, but at 16 you can get married, vote, join the army. You know, there seems to be confusion there.
I'm sure the confusion is genuine because I think it keeps people from actually seeing what is really going on. You've got a document here which I think is talking about what's happening in America at the moment, plans to control every aspect of family life. This is more of the picture.
Yes, I thought this was interesting because it shows the named person ideas are not, although Scotland is a world leader in this form of tyranny, the named person ideas are not confined to Scotland. Here we're seeing similar ideas spreading across in America, where parents and families are being assessed. This document requires teachers to go to individual homes on a regular basis to have a cosy chat with families and discuss how the child's to be reared. So again, it's the state becoming ever more involved in how an individual family functions, the state imposing its standards, and woe betide those who have a different opinion.
Okay. Well, just a quick advert for the road show, because I know that the team are doing a particularly good job in Scotland. So more venues coming up. Aberdeen next.
Aberdeen on the last day, Monday the 29th of February, and then Arbroath in March.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to do is just jump forward to Sheku Bayo, because I believe that there's some progress in as much as the police now really coming under pressure.
Yes, there is now a new investigation, a reopened investigation into what happened. And Police Scotland are in conversation with the Health and Safety Executive. So they seem to be treating this as a health and safety failure. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that, because I don't think we've really seen evidence that would suggest it was health and safety, because if there's gross recklessness, that's not really a health and safety matter. It would be more of a sort of general criminal common law matter, but we don't maybe use the common law so much. So the health and safety legislation is an easy win for the Crown Office, because they will get a conviction, because under health and safety law, you're basically guilty unless you can prove yourself innocent. The burden of proof is reversed. And it will give them some sort of closure on the case. Whether it will give Sheku Bayo's family the justice that they deserve, I'm unconvinced. It may do. Let's hope it does.
Okay, but meanwhile, facts emerging about companies set up by the Chief Constable, Sir Stephen House. I find this fascinating, because we see the police becoming more and more commercial at every step.
Well, so Stephen House, when Stephen House resigned, 6 months after I said he'd resign, so he was very annoyingly adhesive. He was very difficult to get rid of. But eventually he did go very considerably early, and nobody was weeping at his departure. I thought that was the last we'd get to talk about Sir Stephen House, but no, it transpired that during the last 3 months of his employment, 200 and something thousand pounds a year employment, he was doing a lot of work from home. And he was missing quite a lot of meetings. A lot of meetings were cancelled. Big sort of, passing out parades, this sort of stuff. He wasn't turning up. But it transpired that he was opening up his own private firm called Sarantium Solutions Limited. Now, Sarantium comes from a novel, a Byzantium-based fantasy novel, which is apparently very popular. I haven't read it, but that's where the word comes from, it would seem. And Sarantium Solutions is based in beautiful downtown Brighton, and will presumably, it's not clear exactly what it's selling, but presumably it will be selling the unique experience, abilities, guidance, public speaking, entertainment, and strategic thinking that only Sir Stephen House can offer the world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will continue to watch Mr. House. How is Robert Green getting on at the moment?
Well, we've made a wee bit of progress on finding out how Dame Elise Angelini got the money to take out a private civil legal action against Robert for defamation. Now, we've been asking these questions for years, and little bit by little bit, we're starting to find out. We were told by Audit Scotland that it was in fact the ministerial code that authorised the expenditure. Now, when we went to the ministerial code, we couldn't see anything that actually said anything about money. There was a requirement or a clause that said that if someone was was either being sued or there was an inquiry, and an individual government minister required to be involved in litigation, then the government would have a look at the situation to make sure any conflicts of interest were resolved and the government interest was protected. But it didn't say anything about money. So we continued asking questions about where did the money come from, and it transpires it actually comes from the Scottish Government Staff Handbook. So there's a clause in there, which maybe, can you bring it up? It says...
was it the first... Sorry, was it the... if we go back, this was the first part of the letter.
Yeah, it
You'll have
says
to. I'm sorry. You'll have to tell us what it is. I'm not.
right,
I'm not able to expand that particular
right.
clause.
Okay, just bear with me one quick moment while I get it to hand. It's the statement is that under certain circumstances, the Scottish government. Oh, here we go. Right. The staff handbook, right? This is the Scottish Government Staff Handbook, clause 12.2. It says staff may be involved in legal proceedings or formal inquiries arising from their employment. The Scottish Government has discretion to grant staff so involved some or all of their legal representation or to pay for some or all of their legal costs. In deciding whether to exercise this discretion, the following considerations will be taken into account. 1. Whether or not it is in the Scottish Government's interest to grant assistance. And 2. Whether the act giving rise to proceedings of inquiry was committed or suffered within the scope of the member of staff's employment. And that's it. There are no more safeguards than that. So just to reflect briefly on what that means. Robert Greene criticised Dame Elise Angelini. Robert Greene had evidence that Dame Elise Angelini, written evidence, documentary evidence, knew about the Holly Gregg case and was denying that she knew anything about it. So he publicised that fact and was heavily critical of Dame Elise Angelini. Dame Elise Angelini sued for defamation. And what wasn't revealed at the time is that the entire cost of that suit was picked up by the government. So we have a situation, if you criticise any government official, and this is a staff handbook, so this is any government official, and use criticism of an individual as a way of highlighting some failing or some injustice that the government is perpetrating, then the government can decide that it's in the government's interest, because it's not the people of Scotland's interest, it's not the taxpayer of the United Kingdom's interest, it's the Scottish government's interest. The government can decide it's in its interest to fund a private libel, slander or Scotland defamation case against you and destroy you financially. And you won't even know it's their money that's doing it.
Right.
And there are no more checks or balances than that. There's 2 bullet points and that's it. And it's not in legislation. It's not on anything that's seen parliamentary scrutiny. It's not on anything in any legal terms that we, the public, are bound by. It's in an internal staff manual.
David, this follows on from Tony Blair's statement. I think it was about 2000, about the elite coming into power. They don't have to obey the rules. They make the rules. They can change the rules to suit themselves. So this is dangerous stuff. And in the last couple of minutes, just take us through the refugee issue north of the border, because we've got the same thing happening here. Somebody's been speaking out and they're going to be censored.
Yeah, someone, now the person may well have been posting something entirely inappropriate. I actually don't know what the post was, because Police Scotland won't tell me. But there was a man arrested over posts on social media, I think on Facebook, about the refugees coming to Bute. Now, just to review very briefly what this is, Scotland has said they'll take 1,000 refugees. So Britain's taken, I think, 5,000 or 6,000. Scotland said, no, we'll take 1,000. So we've taken a larger number than Britain as a whole, proportion to population. But we're not distributing them through Scotland. We're putting them on one very small island where there's only 6,000 population to start with. So 1 in 7 people will be a refugee. Now that will have a huge impact on that island, on its culture, on life on that island. Pro rata, if you distributed those people across Scotland, the island of Bute, pro rata on population, would have 1 person, but they're having all 1,000 put on one island. I think that's a very bizarre decision for a start that the Scottish Government should make. Why would you concentrate the problem there? It sounds a little bit like internment, to be honest. It sounds odd. But why would you concentrate all these people on one island? I can see them putting, not just one person, but maybe two or three families on a small island, because you want to have someone from your home country in those circumstances, someone who speaks the same language. You don't want to be feeling completely alone. I can see that. But all 1,000 on Bute?
Well, if your objective was to cause trouble, that would be perhaps an ideal thing to do.
That's how you would do it. Yes, absolutely. If you were wanting it to be a disaster, that's how you would do it.
Okay.
So someone then tweeted or went onto Facebook and said something about this, which was detrimental. I don't know, maybe abusive. I'm not absolutely sure what the post was. They have been arrested. There was a complaint. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think the complaint actually came from the minister in the SNP government. Yes, this gentleman, Mr. Yusuf here, who is not the favourite person of Breitbart in London. They're not awfully keen on him, and have been criticising his comments about support for extreme positions and support for unrestricted or very, very large scale immigration by refugees. So he's a somewhat controversial political figure and has some control over this. And he made a complaint to Police Scotland about online abuse. And I suspect, I haven't absolutely got this confirmed, but I suspect it's that complaint that resulted in the person concerned being arrested. And Police Scotland then put out a warning to the rest of us, great unwashed in Scotland, to watch what we say, that this will not be tolerated. So it was publicised very widely that this man had been arrested for something he had written. Now, again, there are huge implications to this, because it's all done fairly secretively. We will eventually get a report on this, but it'll all be sub judice for a while. So it'll be months before we find out what's actually happening, what the man actually said. So if you say something that a government minister might not like, can he go to Police Scotland? And there's no real separation of powers in Scotland anymore. It's one unified police force, and they're extremely close to government. Extremely close to government. So close to government, if we were writing to Police Scotland about the Holly Gregg case, asking questions about how they conducted themselves, the responses, we've been told, were being coordinated by the Justice Secretariat in the Scottish Government. So there is no separation there. So it's one giant joined up Scottish model of government,
one collaborative government.
Yes.
David, we are over for time, so I think we're going to have to stop what is a fascinating and very serious subject to what's going on north of the border. We'll end on a little bit of black humour, which is the cartoon here on planned elderhood. A quick statement from you, please.
I thought this was beautiful. Planned Parenthood is a terrible organisation that kills millions of people when they're very young, and I thought that was an exact description of the correct response from anyone who's getting on in years to any sorts of these sorts of ideas starting to become popular at the far end of life, as we've seen in the Liverpool care pathway.
Right. Well, David, once again, thank you very much for your excellent analysis. Certainly Scotland is proving to be a role model for the new system of government, which is unfolding in UK, and as people are saying in the chat box, unfolding worldwide. We'll continue to be analysing and explaining what is going on with that. The solution is for people to speak out, is to simply withdraw consent, and of course is to motivate their friends and families to also research to understand what's happening. On that note, it's time for us to go. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for supporting us. If you haven't taken out a subscription, please consider doing so. We can only do the UK Column News with your help and support. Thanks very much. We'll be back same time on Monday. Bye-bye.